Thank you very much. I'd first like to start by saying my name is Chuck Romine. I'm the director of the Information Technology Laboratory at the National Institute of Standards and Technology, or Nist. And I'm thrilled to be here today to lead this panel, moderate this panel on privacy and IoT. This is an important topic area for us to cover. I also want to say the previous moderators have set a pretty high bar, so I'm a little bit concerned about that, but we'll see how it goes. I want to start by talking a little bit. I want to make one statement about ITL's purpose, so the Information Technology Laboratory at Nist. The purpose of my laboratory is to cultivate trust in information technology and metrology. And there is no way to cultivate trust in information technology without addressing the privacy issue in the room. And we have a privacy engineering program in ITL that is intended to build, to help provide the tools that can build privacy considerations into systems before they're deployed. So I just wanted to get that out of the way. We have an entire set of panels that is dedicated to celebrating the capabilities that have been developed over the last 30 years in the NITRD program, and I've been privileged to be a part of the NITRD program for about 20 of those 30 years. But we also, the NITRD agencies invest in understanding and providing tools to mitigate the risks associated with those new capabilities as well. And so you've heard some of that conversation going on. There's a thread throughout all of these panels that talks about both the benefits and the extraordinary capabilities that have been delivered through these investments, and then the associated risks. Now, I will introduce the panel in just a moment with very brief introductions before we get into the topic. But I want to mention something else, which is perhaps the most important investment that we make from Nist in the NITRD program is Cami Roberts. Cami is the director of the National Coordination Office for the NITRD program, and she and the extraordinary staff that she's privileged to lead are doing just an outstanding job of helping the agencies navigate through this. And so I want to take the opportunity to lead a round of applause for Cami and the whole National Coordination Office. So Cami is, as I mentioned, an ITL employee and has been on detail as the NCO director for a very long time. I want to tell you a very quick story before we get started. I had the privilege of being the acting director of the National Coordination Office for about 10 months a number of years ago. So I can tell you it's an incredibly difficult job that balances technical acumen with extraordinary need for interpersonal skills. And that's why Cami excels at that. I had one opportunity to call a congressional staffer when I was the acting director. It was a cold call, and I said, yeah, my name is Chuck Romine. I'm the acting director of the National Coordination Office for the Networking and Information Technology Research and Development Program. And there was this long pause, and he said, "You must be very proud." Okay. So on to the introductions. Let me start. We're going to go in a speaking order here, where I'm going to give a question to each of our panelists for the principal answer, and then some commentary from the others. I want to start with Mark Groman. I don't know that he's going to really appreciate this, but I describe Mark as one of the early privacy warriors. This is someone who has cared deeply about privacy for a very long time. He was appointed senior advisor for privacy in the Obama White House. And served as the chair of the Federal Privacy Council. Prior to that, he was the chief privacy officer at the FTC. To my immediate left, so Mark is on my far left. To my immediate left is Ed Felton, the Robert E. Kahn Professor of Computer Science and Public Affairs at Princeton University. He's the past director of Princeton's Center for Information Technology Policy and also served as the Deputy U.S. Chief Technology Officer. Next to Ed is Kat Magus, who is the program manager for Nist's Cybersecurity for IoT program. She formerly worked in identity management space, in biometrics, in smart card technologies, and in the development of single sign-on tools. And so she's had a very large footprint in the IT space. And finally, next to her is Sonu Park, who is a postdoctoral fellow at Cornell's Digital Life Initiative. She's a rising star in the intersection of computer science and law and policy. She has a JD from Harvard Law and a PhD in computer science from MIT, which gives me an entire new meaning of exhausted, I think. I can't imagine pursuing that, but kudos to her. Okay, so with the introductions out of the way, we toyed with the idea of my coming out here and saying, so this privacy thing is all overblown, right? There's nothing really here. But I couldn't bring myself to do that. The goal was to do something provocative, right? But I couldn't bring myself to do that because of the privacy engineering effort at Nist. I think they would have had my head when I got back to Nist, so I can't do that. Instead, I'd like to start with Mark and ask you the following. And there are several questions. It's sort of a portmanteau here. I think the key thing that we need to understand is what do you think privacy risk actually is? We're talking about privacy risk, particularly in the context of IoT. What is it? Does everybody understand it the same way? Is privacy distilled down to just protecting personally identifiable information, or PII? Is it different for IoT than in other things? And if not, how do we talk about privacy in the context of the Internet of Things so that consumers can understand the risk? So can you set the stage for us a little bit?
Okay, great. Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here with my esteemed colleagues and at a great event to celebrate 30 years. And so I'm thrilled we're talking about privacy. What I want to do first is distinguish privacy from what we've been talking about most of the day or much of the day, which is security and cybersecurity, because the interests and the risks are different. I will also say, and I've been known for saying that, despite the fact that over my 20-year career, the word privacy has been in every title I've had, including at the White House, I hate the word because I do not think the word privacy captures what we're talking about any longer. The Europeans use data protection, which is more broad. But when I think about this subject, I am thinking about the adverse consequences of processing data to individuals, rather than trying to bucket it into a word privacy, which can have 10 different meanings to 10 different people. But we'll stick with it for now because it's the word we've got, and it's in the title of your panel. So here's how I want to separate it out, is that when we think about security of your network or of your device, we're talking about confidentiality, integrity, availability of data. That is what we're talking about with information security. And it's generally clear and easy to understand the concepts, and we can build around that. Privacy is completely different. We'll talk about the overlap. But it is not simply confidentiality, integrity, availability. What we're talking about now is how are you using the data? Why was it collected? What are you collecting? What is the purpose? Who will you share it with and why? How will it be transferred? What inferences will be made and why? And how can we limit or restrict that so that we can limit adverse consequences down the road? So you can have data that is secure, meaning you are protecting it from unauthorized access, and you can have authorized processing of data that produces privacy harms. It can be completely secure, but we can have serious adverse consequences from privacy harm. So that's how I distinguish it at a higher level. With respect to Internet of Things, so we can break it down a little bit more when we're talking about connected devices. On the security side, we have, right, secure your device. Make sure no one can hack it so that they can't shut down the power plant or open the dam or change the temperature in your home, right? Keep the device secure. But many devices in the IoT, Internet of Things, are collecting or creating or disseminating data. And so that data must be secure. That's the security of the data. We have the security of your device. Within the data is, in many cases, a subset of data, which is data about or relating to people. That's the privacy side of Internet of Things. When you have a device in my home, you have sensors in my home, what is it collecting about me or about my home that then produces inferences of information about me? And what do we do with it? So we can assume that data, let's hope, it's secure. But the IoT has all these issues presented about data about people, including, do people know that my TV is collecting data about me? Is there an interface where I can interact with this device and learn what it's collecting or change it? Do I understand what's being collected and then what inferences are being made by the device or the company from the data that's being collected? So that's sort of a lot, but that separates out security from sort of the privacy interests, and it also boils it down to some of my concerns with the IoT.
Terrific. Anybody else want to sort of weigh in? Does that summarize it pretty well? Or Kat?
Yeah, I do think you summarized everything. We try and focus on what makes IoT different, because there are obviously privacy concerns across the technology ecosystem, but why is IoT different? And I think one of the things we identified is obviously scale. The scale of devices is just phenomenal. So what were previously seen as harms are just exponentially growing now. And then I think it's the what, where, and the how about IoT devices that makes it different, right? It's what kind of data is it collecting about us? And I think previously, the type of data that was being collected about individuals was related to types of data that we were inputting. But now when you're looking at IoT devices, they're implanted on you. They could be data about your health. They could be data about your energy consumption in your home. They could be data about how off tune you might sing in the shower when you think nobody's listening to you. So now you're starting to aggregate data about the individual and things that are physical attributes about the individual that aren't necessarily something we've looked at before. Then it's the how that the information is being collected as well. IoT devices are so pervasive in our life right now. They're in physical spaces. You're not even aware many times that those IoT devices are around you. When you look at the scenario of smart cities, you're looking at sensors that have been deployed in public places that are collecting information about you. So that's also slightly different, I think, between kind of the traditional IT world and kind of now that we're starting to look at IoT devices. So I talked about the how, I talked about the where. And of course, the last thing I wanted to talk about the devices as well is that it's just so scalable and just being everywhere. You really don't have any idea how that data can get aggregated in the future. So while a manufacturer of a device may look at it and say, well, this is great, I've just got this sensor. This sensor is collecting a piece of very innocuous data. As the IoT ecosystem grows and as those devices are discoverable and begin to get integrated into new systems and used in new ways, what was previously seen as innocuous data, as it becomes combined with other pieces of data, may actually introduce larger privacy harms. And I think I'm going to talk about that a little bit when I start talking about cybersecurity. But it's really about the context of the use that may impact the risk more than the actual device itself.
Terrific. Ed or Sunu, either?
Sure. I think these questions about what happens when we have these devices all around us, the devices that we ourselves introduce into our own lives, but also the devices that are built into the environment and that are carried and installed by the people who are around us and control the spaces that we move in. It's not always obvious just by inspection what the implications are of this. And this is an area where research over the last 30 years has really, I think, helped to shed light on what's happening. Research to help understand what information could be collected and by whom. Research to understand what information is being collected and by whom. And then, of course, downstream from that, more research to try to understand the implications of all of this and what we might do about it.
Terrific. And of course, the good news is that there's no possibility that once the information is collected that it'll be sold to anyone else. We don't have to worry about that.
Yep.
So yeah, that's great. Right, so let me move on to, Mark teed up this idea that obviously cybersecurity and privacy are very, very different things, and privacy harms can accrue without any cybersecurity event actually having taken place, which is an important point to understand, that not every privacy event is traceable back to some breakdown in security. In fact, it's much deeper and more insidious than that, perhaps. So the question is that I want to ask Kat, because she's been working in cybersecurity of IoT for years now, and has been paying attention more recently to the privacy implications. One of the big challenges, and I alluded to it a little bit in my snarky comment, I guess, is how do we make progress in improving privacy protections when capitalizing on the information, once the information has been gathered, once there is a collection of information, it turns out to be incredibly valuable and monetizable in many ways. How do we overcome, this is not a cybersecurity issue per se, but how do we make progress when the amount of money that could be made with a lot of this information is so vast?
Yeah.
That's a tough one.
That is a tough one that I
throwing you a curveball here.
I work for Chuck, so I have to be careful. I don't have the answer to that one exactly, Chuck. I do want to say, coming from the cybersecurity space, I do tend to always focus on the doom and gloom and think about all the things that can go wrong. And when Chuck and Jim and others in the ITL division asked me to step up and take on IoT cybersecurity, they reminded me that the reason we're undertaking this effort is because we want to be able to actually see IoT recognized, and we want to be able to see IoT's benefits get actually reaped by society. So I do want to kind of keep the focus on the fact that the whole reason for doing this is to ensure that there is trust in IoT, and so there are other reasons for wanting to see data shared, and I know a lot of people focus on the monetization of IoT, but we have another project that we're looking at, which is looking broadly at what are potential barriers to IoT adoption. And we had a very interesting meeting yesterday with a group that has been looking at this area for a while, and they highlighted 3 areas that they saw were going to impact the US's ability to actually adopt IoT technologies. The first one they mentioned was skills. So it's very interesting today. I think there's been a lot of threads across all of the discussions today on skills and how we have to ensure that there's a skill set out there, especially around cybersecurity. Because if you think about it, now that we've started building IT components into these devices that previously weren't smart. We're talking about vacuum cleaners. Again, we're talking about scale. The demand for the cybersecurity workforce now is just phenomenal, and it's growing exponentially. So really important, I think, that we make sure that we look at how we can ensure that we have a sufficient workforce to fill the need there. The second thing they brought up was trust. So you teed that up perfectly. They said trust is probably one of the top 3 reasons that they see that IoT could potentially not be adopted and its full potential not be recognized. And yes, trust is anchored in cybersecurity and privacy, but there are also other aspects that I think we have to think about balancing when we think about IoT and we think about trust in IoT. It's around safety, it's around resilience. It is not just about cybersecurity, and as a cybersecurity professional, I have to keep that always in mind. Just yesterday, I was speaking to one of my colleagues in ITL, and he's focused on looking at implantable devices and looking at how we can harness movement and wearables in individuals to actually generate energy and be able to recharge those implantables to actually minimize the medical intervention that's required to actually change the batteries on these implantable devices. And he pointed out that the minute they built in encryption into that over-the-air kind of processing of power and transmitting that power to the implantable, it actually became negative, that the consumption of energy was actually higher than the energy that they were able to produce. So again, you have to balance and you have to look across the entire kind of trust ecosystem, and privacy is obviously one of them. And then the third barrier that they brought up was data and the availability of data. And it's funny because coming on the heels of AI, we talked a lot about artificial intelligence. And when I think about artificial intelligence, I think about the need for data, training data that AI needs, but also you're looking at the fact that AI is actually going to exponentially make use of a lot of the data that's out there, and there are very positive things that can be reaped from this access to data. But they also said the importance of sharing the data across IoT, because when you look at a smart city scenario, and when you look at the sensor data and the possibility to collect sensor data from perhaps sensor data related to pollution, and the ability to potentially cross-tabulate some of that with perhaps medical information, you could perhaps identify patterns across these different data sets and learn things that could actually have high impact potential for individuals and great benefits for society. So they highlighted the need to be able to share data. And then the third reason they identified for why we need to be able to share data across organizations was not so much pointing to the business reason, but they said a lot of small, innovative companies were actually identifying as a barrier to actually market entry, the ability to test their devices, because they simply didn't have the data sets available to them to actually to test those devices. So again, they talked a lot about this need to have access to the data that a lot of some of the larger manufacturers of IoT devices had. And they needed the ability to be able to get that data from those large manufacturers. So while you did say, there is this new, I think they call it data product. And sometimes when you look at the IoT, hype cycle, they talk about the next kind of big thing is going to be the data product, which is going to be selling to the customer products that are really derived out of the data and less from the actual device. So I think that this is a challenge. I don't have the answer. I think this is where some of the innovation and some of the research here is looking at this area. But I think it's important not just to address the business kind of challenges, but also so we can recognize all the IoT potential that's there.
I see
quick,
Mark
so I don't-
champing at the bit here. So.
Yeah.
So I don't disagree with anything you've said, and I don't disagree that there are extraordinary benefits from IoT and technology generally. My house is wired to the hilt, right? I have everything. I have more devices than I could possibly count. And the goal here is to, maximize benefits and minimize harm. The problem is, and none of my colleagues or co-panelists who are in the government can say this, and for the first time in a long time, I'm not. The fact is, we do not have a policy, legal, or regulatory framework in this country that produces incentives to get there. We do not have a framework that induces companies to get to a place where we're maximizing benefits and minimizing harm. We have a framework that maximizes profits and shareholder value over other interests. And so the fact is, to get to a solution, and I'll welcome a debate with anyone, we are 20 years overdue for a comprehensive privacy law in this country. We're the only democracy that doesn't have one. And until we are able to address these issues in a reasonable way through legislation and regulation that will support technology, we're going to have a long-term problem.
So, Ed.
I want to jump in here because I'm not going to disagree with Mark's basic point. I think we do need to have a fundamental law and framework for dealing with privacy in the policy and law world. The challenge here is that we had a model for this in sort of the early days of the computer revolution, which kind of sort of worked. We've lost that model over time. It no longer applies, and we don't have a new model to replace it with. Let me explain what I mean by that. Sort of the early model was based on this notion, essentially the model that you would fill out a form and send it in to someone, and that information would go into a database, and that the computer system was a giant filing cabinet with all of this information, and the risk was that this information would live longer than you expected and be used for other purposes. And so that said, that there's a focus on disclosure of data as opposed to how it's going to be used later. There's a model of notice and consent, which is not so difficult to apply when someone is filling out and submitting a form, but doesn't really work so well anymore when they're when they're putting a medical monitor on their wrist or there's a camera in the corner. Notice and consent is very difficult. It's difficult to even imagine how you would implement it for something like, say, ubiquitous cameras that exist in the world. So that model doesn't work so well anymore. And there's a focus as well in that model on the sharing of data as being the sort of relevant boundary crossing event. Whereas nowadays, much more of what happens is we think much more in terms of querying of data or people being able to make use of the existence of data without actually acquiring the full data set. So much of what blew up that mental model was changes in technology, but also research has helped us understand how that model was starting to break down. Now, the big challenge is, what are we going to replace it with? And here again, I think research is starting to point the way, but we're not really to the point where we have a new model that works in a new way that can answer all the questions that the old model answered in that old world. And to me, that's one of the big challenges, and it ought to be one of the North Stars for research in this area. Try to understand how we can cope with this issue, what kinds of controls and user experience we can do, and how can we make advanced technology our friend in dealing with these challenges instead of making it out as an enemy.
Okay, so Ed, let me pull that thread a little more and ask you to expand on something, and then I'll lob the next question to Sunu. So the issue is a regulatory environment, or at least as Mark calls for, a robust policy in place for protection of data. Is there the potential for a technological solution? And if so, what might that look like? How can we provide people with tools, technological tools, that can be used to help improve the situation?
It's early days in understanding all of this, I think, but I think we have some idea of how this might play out and how we can build a new technical reality that better serves the interests of all of us as we deal with these privacy issues. Part of the picture, I think, is in understanding and, more importantly, better applying what's known about statistical information control, right? So this idea of people making inferences about us based on collected information, based on queries to information, how does that all work? We're starting now to build a theory of how we can allow people to interact with data in a way that is privacy preserving. And I think that is a really important piece of it, right? How can we do this? Because that helps us get closer to that, to this goal of understanding how we can capture the positive aspects of information collection and the use of information while controlling the negative aspects. How can we be selective? Not just how do we give all the information to that person over there, but what kind of interface or interactive protocol can we create to allow them to get the positive benefits while controlling the negative effects, or at least to let them do what they want to do while being able to rigorously control the negative impacts. There's a lot of really exciting research that's coming out around these sort of privacy-preserving information processing technologies. And I think there's a huge space there, not only for research to make life better, but also for research to show the way to policymakers about what a better world would look like.
Fantastic. So I'm thrilled with your comment because it's the perfect setup for Sunu, right? So following on Ed's answer with respect to technology, You've specifically been looking at the role of cryptographic protocols or cryptography as a potential tool to help in this solution. And your background combines perfectly the sort of deep technical expertise with the policy apparatus and the policy understanding that you have. So can you talk to us a little bit about the role of cryptography? I had originally decided I would ask you, is cryptography the magic bullet that's going to make it all work? And I knew your answer would be no, so there's no point in asking it that way. But give us a little glimpse into the work that you're doing in using cryptography to help address some of these issues.
Right, yeah. So cryptography can definitely help without being a magic bullet. And I guess, we've heard a lot about what privacy risk is and that it relates to adverse consequences of processing data. It relates to what kinds of information flows we consider appropriate in what contexts, and the potential risks of those information flows and uses within that framework. And so cryptography provides a toolkit to build systems that have new configurations of information flows. And that includes basically more fine-grained control over access and partial access to data, and keeping data secret or partially secret even from entities that process it, and so on. So, for example, you and I might message each other on WhatsApp, which is an end-to-end encrypted messaging platform, and then our messages would pass through the WhatsApp server, but WhatsApp wouldn't be able to read the message content because of the way the encryption was used. Or using a different cryptographic technique called zero-knowledge proofs, I might be able to prove to somebody that I have an ID that says I'm over 21 without revealing to them my exact age and my address and my birth date and whatever else might actually be on the physical ID that I would show them. And so cryptography provides a sort of larger solution space that we can use to build privacy-preserving technologies, but like any toolkit, it doesn't answer the question of what sorts of things that we should build using these tools. And so it doesn't answer what sort of information sharing and use we consider appropriate or desirable or too risky in what contexts, and importantly, sort of what sort of benefits and risks are entailed by each kind of use and for whom, and whether we think that's okay. So that's really a question that we have to work out as a society and as a matter of policy. And cryptography is just one tool that we can use to inform that discussion. And yeah, I guess as it relates to IoT specifically, there's a lot of cryptographic techniques that already exist that could help. And there's also ongoing research in sort of adapting cryptography to particularly suit the needs of IoT applications, including, for example, like Kat was referring to specific considerations about aggregation of data. How can we get some of the benefits of aggregating data without all of the harms that it may entail? And also, many IoT devices are very lightweight, as was also mentioned, and so adapting cryptographic techniques to be compatible and very efficient on these types of devices is another important area of research. So that's all to say cryptography can be helpful, and it's important that we're careful not to treat it as a magic bullet, because using cryptography doesn't necessarily mean that a thing is more privacy protective. You could use encryption to transmit sensitive information to someone who shouldn't have it, and there the cryptography is really not helping with the privacy problem. So we need to pay attention that the way that we use the cryptography is really addressing specific privacy needs in the context we deploy them.
Excellent, thanks very much. Ed or Mark? Or
okay, I'm going to bounce off. So everything, Ed and I are on the same page about like notice and choice. I mean, like, forget it. But you raised, and you asked about technology. So I've got, a question. I have this really weird fantasy that science and evidence might actually inform our laws. It'd be really cool. And so if you look at a lot of the privacy laws in the states that are popping up, there's a particular issue that particularly concerns me, which is definitions that are getting codified into these laws. This category of data that our state legislatures are calling de-identified data is just carved out of privacy law. So if it's not identified or personally identifiable, if it's not your name, your social security number, or your phone number, we're not going to cover it by this privacy law. So everything de-identified is like, so we're getting these laws, but it's not even covered.
Yes. Yeah.
What do we need to address that. What does it mean that it's de-identified? And if my name isn't there, doesn't mean a decision about me can't be made that could harm me.
I think this question connects in an interesting way also to what Sanu was talking about, which is that policymakers' intuitions about how these things work or what's possible and not possible with technology are, unsurprisingly, like most people's, who, without a lot of training and study, often not very accurate. So this idea of de-identified data seems to make intuitive sense, but from a purely scientific standpoint, it doesn't really stand up. You need to think about the question of what can be inferred from data in a different way. And the same is true, I think, with respect to uses of cryptography, right? That in some respects, cryptography is much more powerful than an untrained intuition might suggest. Something like a zero-knowledge proof would seem intuitively to be impossible, but it's well established in cryptography that that's possible. But then there's some other things that you might intuitively expect to be possible with cryptography that turn out not to be. So this mismatch between the intuition that many people, including policymakers, have about what's possible and what technology can and can't do versus what the reality is, in my mind, one of the big challenges. And I don't know, I'm curious, Sunu, if you have thoughts about how we might improve that.
Yeah, so I am also on the same page about de-identification and notice and consent and all that. I think de-identification is an interesting example where we've seen a dialogue developing, sort of starting in the technical community about how these methods are ineffective and what sorts of sensitive information can be recovered from de-identified data. And that information, that sort of research and dialogue sort of drifting over into the law and policy space, and current legal approaches are inadequate and still largely based on de-identification, but there seems to be a growing recognition of the need to approach even the legal definitions differently because of demonstrated technical research. So I'm curious to see what happens next. And I agree with Mark as well that a focus on the sort of consequences of processing this data rather than identifiability or something that is not as tied to the sort of harm that we're trying to prevent.
I just want to address a verb you used, which is drifting into policy. So I've been in DC a long time. These laws, just so we all know, were written by 6 or 7 really big companies on the West Coast. So it's not like, there's no accident to it, right? It was sort of like word for word and given to a certain state legislator to pass and codify into these laws a framework that is really, it's outdated before it's gone into law. And now it's going to sort of populate around the country and not produce, it's not true that doing nothing is, doing something is better than nothing. Doing something that doesn't do what you think it does can actually be a worse outcome.
Yeah, I think I meant more sort of drifting into the law and policy dialogue rather than drifting into the law itself.
So you've eliminated one of the questions I have on here, which is why can't we just de-identify everything and eliminate the privacy risk altogether? So I'm going to skip that question because it's appropriately naive and I've already been disabused of that notion. So thank you. I'll ask another provocative question, this time to all of you. Anybody would like to chime in, which is, why should I care that my IoT devices are grabbing everything about me? I don't have anything to hide. It's not a big deal. Why should I pay attention to this debate? Why does it matter?
Well, you do probably have something to hide. I think we all do have some things that we would rather not be public.
I'd prefer, by the way, that no one go looking for anything that I might be willing to hide. Thank you.
There's nothing wrong with having something to hide, right? That's why we're all fully clothed. So the other thing I would say about this, all jokes aside, these information that exists about us that might be used, it reduces our freedom of action in the future. It reduces the opportunities available to us. It may allow people to infer things about us that we as a society believe people should not be finding out about each other. It's a loss of control over your own fate and over your own set of choices, fundamentally, that can happen when people out there build a very comprehensive model of who you are and what you're likely to do. And sometimes we're afraid that those models will be wrong and will be harmed. Sometimes we're afraid that those models will be correct and will be harmed as a result. But either way, as individuals, we'd like to have more control, and as a society, we'd like to have policies about what information about people goes where.
And it also will it also will impact different groups differently, and I think that's a very important point. And so for some communities, perhaps at this moment in time, you're less concerned, but for other communities, knowing that your entire surfing behavior and what you're reading and where you're researching or where you're praying, where that's being collected, or, I don't know, getting an abortion and having an app track you there, or having geofencing around abortion clinics for advertisements. I mean, so I'm not in that position right now, but for a lot of communities, the stakes are much higher, and that's important. And it's not just by it's about, it could be sexual orientation or gender or race, or it could be children or battered women who need to, stay and avoid the batterer. I mean, there's a lot of groups within that. And so that's also an important point. We may not all feel it the same way.
One of the threads that has come through every single panel is the impact of either the positive or negative aspects of the development of information technologies of the last 30 years having a disproportionate impact, either positive or negative, on certain populations, right? That has come across in every single panel, and it's certainly true here as well. So, agreed. I want to spend enough time in this phase before we open it up to questions to talk a little bit about two things. One is workforce issues, and the other is what NITRD can do. I'm going to start by pulling a thread that Kat started, which is this growing concern, and I think in the last panel they talked about the exponential growth of certain aspects of technology, in this case artificial intelligence, and the linear growth of things to deal with it, and the fact that those things that's not sustainable, right? And I think workforce is one of those things. We're getting to the stage where certainly in cybersecurity, we're seeing this, and we have the National Initiative for Cybersecurity Education that's trying to address some of these workforce challenges in cybersecurity, but you can multiply that in AI and in quantum information science and artificial intelligence. I mean, I said artificial intelligence, but I'm in privacy. Where are the privacy experts? Where are the cybersecurity experts? We can't scale our way out of this problem by just developing, armies and armies of people. So what do we do about this?
That was a question from me to answer?
See, I get to put Kat on the spot because she works in my lab. So.
Absolutely.
I wasn't sure what the question was. I just
Yeah. I think I like to look at some of the work that we do, hopefully at Nist, to contribute to that, is putting some of those tools out there, putting those frameworks out there. And while frameworks aren't always a playbook.
Great answer.
Okay.
Okay, good.
Okay. Earned this year's bonus. Just kidding. But I do think that the only way that we can actually because again, we can't train everybody. We can't put armies of everybody out there. But what we can do is we can put the tools out there and try to bring everybody out there kind of up to speed, give them a framework to think about risk, whether it be cybersecurity risk or whether it be privacy risk. And hopefully that's one way. I think there's obvious work that we can do to actually make perhaps some tools available to automate some of these processes.
So can I poke you on that?
Oh, go ahead and poke me.
You said we could. So
as long as it's not about.
Right. So I know how you can give an assignment to your engineer and say, okay, as you build out this database or this network, I want you to make sure that you do security by design, and I want you to bake in confidentiality, integrity, and availability.
Right.
So what do you tell your engineer? Like, I want you to just bake in privacy into this thing.
Yeah. No.
Just like, here you go.
But that's not the tool.
As you build it. So how do you translate that? What are you going to give to a technologist or an engineer or someone who's coding to ensure that they can protect the subsequent use of data when it's shared?
Well, I think part of it is we don't only focus on the engineer. I think it's actually a top-down corporate governance issue as well. So I think when we're talking about putting the tools out there, and when you look at something like the cybersecurity framework, it's intended to be used both by the corporate governance to kind of understand and inform the organization. This is our appetite for risk. This is what we want to prioritize. This is for our industry where our priorities are in the cybersecurity framework. I would hope that the privacy framework could do something similar. So I think it's more than just tell your software engineer build privacy into this. It does require corporate governance. It requires that permeating and priorities being set. And then the tools being made available, such as low-code options, was something that was brought up and said, hey, we cannot train our way out of a workforce, but perhaps we need to look at tools like low-code options to actually enable organizations who were building physical things and figure out how they can actually build IoT things. So if we can extrapolate that to other desirable attributes that we have around privacy and cybersecurity and make it easier, perhaps we can make better use of the limited resources we have.
Yeah.
I said I didn't have all the answers.
I think it's really important to think about this as leveraging the talent that we have, and that technology can help to do that.
Yeah.
I mean, if you talk to people who teach in universities, they will say enrollments are growing. There is no scarcity of students in the classroom. And more graduates are coming out with the basic skills in these fields. And yet, if you talk to people who are hiring in industry, they will say they wish there were a lot more people. Yeah. And it's just the mismatch, I think, between the workforce, which is growing at a somewhat healthy rate, versus the demand, which is really growing much more quickly. And if we're going to meet that gap, it has to be through better tools that allow the same number of skilled technical people to get more work done and to do it at a higher quality and more accurately in the same time.
Terrific. So the goal here is to look back at the NITRD program, and there's been some remarkable advances over the last 30 years. I think cybersecurity got the early attention and still gets a lot of attention from the NITRD agencies. Privacy is now growing in importance. I know, Mark, you've been sort of a lone wolf in the past trying to get people to pay attention to privacy. I think you got your wish. People are beginning to pay much more attention in the agencies. What can we do that we're not currently doing? Do you have any ideas? Any of you respond to that, and then we'll open it up for questions.
I guess I would start by saying to the NITRD community, keep doing what you're doing. Okay. A lot of these changes and advances that we've talked about up here have been driven by federal information technology research. And there is, and yet, I think the policy community is still awaiting further improvements that we're going to need in order to build that sort of new model that I talked about earlier. This is an area, I think, where there's a lot of leverage, where research can contribute a lot to better policies and toward improving the entire enterprise.
Okay. Anyone else before we open it up?
I'll say I heard a couple of encouraging things today. This idea of like telling stories and getting the message out, I think, is incredibly important. We talked about, how can our policymakers be more informed when they're making policy in areas that are very complex, even for some moderately technical people like myself to follow, let alone, people who are actually mean well, but perhaps don't quite understand the technical area. So figuring out how to actually communicate that in ways to a non-technical audience, and I think stories is a great way. So I was really encouraged to hear that today because I think that is critical. Because anecdotally, I can say when we started down the path of the cybersecurity for IoT program at Nist, we focused on both cybersecurity and privacy because at Nist we feel that as we were putting out publications and guidance, especially those for federal agencies, we said it was really important to give federal agencies guidance on privacy as well. But at some point, we kind of realized that the kind of guideposts around privacy were not out there necessarily the way they were out there for cybersecurity. The maturity of the frameworks and the tools that were out there for cybersecurity were well beyond where privacy was. And because we saw that difference, we said, well, for the time being, we are going to focus on the tools related to cybersecurity because we have kind of a solid foundation there. We have a good understanding of the guardrails, while we're waiting for maybe some of those guardrails in privacy to kind of help us kind of derive where we should be focused on when it comes to the technology and the tools.
This is actually just came to my head now. It's more concrete or very specific, but the one thing that's missing right at the time I left the White House in 2017 because there was an election. What our next project I thought at OMB might have been would be to update guidance on how to actually conduct a privacy impact assessment. And Nist has done work on this in the privacy framework, which says you should do a privacy impact assessment, and here's generally some criteria. What could be done is actually not more guidance, but more guidance with really specific, concrete, complicated examples of how you take this concept of a privacy impact assessment and apply it to these Internet of Things devices or this network or this technology and show how it can be done at the different points, within each point of the life cycle of data, you can make choices. How will that affect privacy if you go left versus right, or if you encrypt or not? That, and that is not a small undertaking, but if there's research with people with that bandwidth, because it's difficult, that would help others as they set out on doing that and not just cut and paste some existing things.
Good.
And throughout this panel, I feel like we've been sort of changing between talking about the skill sets that people with technical backgrounds have to address these problems and how technology can help, and then how the different skill sets that law and policy people can bring and where they meet. But it also seems sort of, instead of going between one and then the other, really important to support research that is across both because the problem is inherently socio-technical.
So it might be good to maybe support people who get their, let's say, their JDs and their PhDs in computer science. Right?
For example.
For example.
What do you mean by socio-technical? Can you just spin that out, socio-technical?
So I think it sort of relates to what the discussion about, for example, the appealing idea of having a technical solution that enforces privacy norms. And I feel like that's very context dependent, right, and society dependent, and it will be a thing that needs to adapt and probably not consist only of a technical expertise. And so sort of co-developing solutions to that, and also improving even at the sort of during the educational curriculum, both the policy side's knowledge of the technical details necessary for this problem, and the technical education coverage of social and policy issues, I think, would be important.
So when are you going to run for Senate?
Terrific. So we have about 5.5 minutes left. I'd like to invite people to come provide their questions to the panel, challenge them.
Come.
Very good. So start over here.
Does this work?
Yes. Could you introduce yourself and where you're
Okay.
from?
My name is Patty Ordóñez. I'm from the University of Puerto Rico in San Juan. And in marginalized communities, a lot of talk is being done about data governance and who owns the data. And you guys talk a lot about trust and the necessity for trust in AI. And so within our communities, a lot of times what we're looking at and thinking like, why can't we use our data as a commodity? Like, why don't we have, because we'll trust the solution more if we can see the data that's collected about us, right? And so what do you think about the idea of data governance? That is, it's a very, very popular thing among Native Americans and other.
So this is being more open and transparent about the data that you have on individuals so that they have
yes, and so that so it's not like this form that's a whole bunch of legalese that that a commoner cannot understand,
Right.
but that they can go in and see who has what of their data, and therefore they trust the applications more. Because I say this also because after Hurricane Maria, there were so many apps going up. Nobody wanted to publish in them because they didn't know who was going to have that data.
Yeah.
And so people wanted to put up sources of water. They wanted to put up where there's electricity. Nobody did for fear.
Yeah.
And even though AI has a big, and everybody's talking about the need for data from these to make it less biased. So why not
this
think of it
trust
as
issue is pivotal here.
Right.
So any comments?
I think
this
that's,
is a-
yeah, go
I think
ahead.
this is a huge issue, to get beyond the kind of theater of notice and consent that is often the reality that many people, including many communities, have to deal with. And how can we get to a place where people not only are told what is happening, but actually play a role in deciding what should happen? I think institutions can play a really important role here. Having the right institution which can speak up on behalf of a community makes a big difference. But how to make sure that there's a real voice in what's done is obviously primarily not a technical problem.
And the access question, sorry.
Of course. Yeah.
The access question, when people make it sound rather simple about why can't I see my data? Well, the question is what data and what category of data? Because we have data that you provide to a company, like when I register for Facebook, but then Facebook has data that other people provided to them about me. More importantly, then they've got my profile and the inferences and inferences from inferences and observed data. So is that also data that I get access to or not? And how do I know if they have it? And actually, they don't want to give that, but that's actually the data that I'm most interested in. And so that question about access becomes much more complicated because it's not the world of 20 years ago where the data is simply the form I filled out online. It's all those preferences and all the inferences. And I'm not sure how we manage access.
So you have to look holistically, right, at the entire data environment.
Yeah. And as you look at IoT, again, it's exponential now because it's passive collection of my data too.
Think about do you want to call them the good old days when there was even the consideration that you could opt out of anything. There's no opting out anymore, right? Everything's ubiquitous. There's if you're a Luddite, you can't possibly disconnect. Anyway, so thank you very much. Next question, please.
Hi, I'll try to make it fast. Ben Zorn from Microsoft. Thank you, very interesting panel. My question is kind of the intersection between AI, the last panel, and this panel, which is these models now are very large, billions of parameters, probably 1 trillion now, and they store a lot of data. I mean, they're trained on data, et cetera. So how does our understanding of what data are in these models and whether or not private information is being leaked through them, how is that developing and what can we do about it?
I'll just make a quick reference to, in the GDPR in Europe, this right to be forgotten. How do you implement that? There was actually a really interesting article I read a year ago, I think, about the destruction of algorithms. If you have algorithms that were built on data that you're not really allowed to have, and you're told, okay, you have to destroy those data, you actually have to go back and destroy those algorithms too, because they are models of the data they ingested. And so the right to be forgotten, you have an echo in the algorithm. You have to get rid of that as well. So it's a big challenge.
So in general, right, if data was given to the training process that trains a model, and if you didn't do something rigorous to prevent that data or downstream information from it from being encoded in the model or emitted by the model, it probably was encoded and emitted, right? One of the things we've learned over time that's come out of research is that unless you use a rigorous method to stop information from flowing, it will probably flow, right? And that's why there's been so much emphasis on building rigorous and provable models of these things, and then the technologies for things like privacy-preserving machine learning. It's early days, again, in those spaces, but I think one of the big lessons is if you don't do something that's grounded in solid research and knowledge, then you're not going to succeed at controlling that.
Apologies, we have negative 15 seconds left.
Thank you.
So thank you very much. So we won't be able to take another question, but I do want to abuse the time long enough for each of my panel members here to give sort of a 15-second observation, closing statement. You want to start, Ed?
Sure. Two things. First of all, as I think I've said various times, it's early days in this area, and there's a lot we still don't know and a lot of knowledge that's going to develop. That's number one. And number two, to Chuck and Cami and many other people who've been involved in NITRD, you should be very proud.
Thank you very much. Kat?
Yeah. I think I'll just say thank you very much. This was such an informative day, and it was fantastic. I'm glad I came early and listened to all the panels because there was something that resonated in every single panel that I listened to today. And I'm also, and in all honesty, I'm so glad that ITL's mission is around trust because I think so much of these discussions that we're having all really go back to trust. Well, how can I have trust in the technology? Because if I don't trust it, I'm not going to use it. And that's, to me, irrespective of whether I'm an individual. But, you know, in IoT, we also look at the industrial applications of IoT. And there are lots of benefits to be reaped there. And I can tell you, healthcare organizations are not going to adopt the technology if they can't trust it. And smart factories are not going to adopt the technology if they can't trust where their data is going and who's using their data. They have proprietary concerns. So the trust question and how do you reflect trust, I think, is going to be one of the big things we should tackle, and then figure out how to build that into what we do.
Terrific. Sonu?
Yeah, I think if I have to pick a point from our discussion, I'd elaborate a bit on Ed's point about intuitions failing us sometimes about the kinds of privacy harms and information flows that can occur. I think as we saw in the last question about machine learning systems, as well as in all of the discussion about sort of increasingly complex and ubiquitous devices, there will be, I think we can rely less and less on our intuition and have to be preemptive in putting in precautions. So yeah, I'm grateful for the discussion.
Terrific. And Mark, you got the first word, you get the last word.
Awesome. So I'm going to make fun of my co-panelists, mostly. First, I've worked with Ed for a very long time, and Ed makes a point that for me is very helpful repeatedly, which is that we're still in the early stages of all of this, and that there are and will be solutions, but they're not going to just happen. And so we're going to need leaders and leadership to make it happen. But it is new, and that allows for optimism. Two, we beforehand, we were talking about our teenagers, and you mentioned trust. And we were saying that our teenage kids do not trust technology any longer and don't trust the big companies any longer. And that's a big change from, say, millennials. The trust is down. And third, when you want to run and be in Congress, I'm there. Because we need that expertise to link that tech and law.
Fantastic. With that, thank you to all the panelists, and thank you for your attention. Well done.